Ooh, boy, where to start with this one? You want to talk about a lecture that modern players need to hear on repeat? This is the one. Welcome, Internet. I'm Daniel. This is Driving Dragons, and today we talk about how you're doing it wrong when it comes to crafting your character's backstory. Fellow game masters, send your players, and thank me later. Keeping with the theme of migraine-inducing frustration, the Nissan Z-Car project will feature yet another example of all the parts that those fancy car restoration shows and channels skip. I went to do a fairly simple EGR delete where the exhaust gas recirculation system is removed from the car. This is a 10-minute job. You take off 2 nuts, disconnect and discard the EPA mandated efficiency and horsepower killing smog control nonsense, pull out the studs, screw on a sweet chrome plate emblazoned with that awesome Z-Car logo. Yeah, well, this is all going pretty well until the pull the studs part. I started with an old shade tree trick, tightened 2 nuts against each other, and basically turned the stud into a bolt to remove it. Stud 1 came right out. Stud 2 snapped. Then I tried to drill it out and use an extractor on it, and I broke my extractor. So I got a special stud removal socket and twisted the whole thing off flush. Long story short, ended up drilling into the stud and just drilled it down into metal shavings, retapped the hole. It's a 15-minute job that took approximately 4 hours, including drives to the parts house, and of course, over the course of about 3 days. So that's enough backstory on the car. What about backstory for your TTRPG player character? How are you doing it wrong, and why does your GM look like he wants to skin you alive every time you roll a new character? Unfortunately, the list of reasons why you're doing backstories all wrong is nigh endless. Player character backstories are one of the biggest sources of frustration for most game masters, particularly those who write their own campaigns and craft their own settings. Luckily, most of these issues can be summed up into a few categories, so I'm going to start to hit on I'm going to hit this one list style. Give you my top 6 with a few honorable mentions at the end. Number 1, out of this world. So the first issue typically stems from a player who has this really awesome, totally original, gonna be so cool idea for a character that they've been thinking on for months or even years. Typically when they're supposed to be thinking about, what they're going to do during their turn on combat. But this character may be really creative and completely out of the box. It may also sound like it would, be really cool. Unfortunately, there's just no way that it's going to fit into the campaign the GM has put together for the next game. Maybe it's a cleric of some deity who has no counterpart in this game world. Perhaps it's a serious grimdark character of tragic origins in a lighthearted comedy campaign. Maybe it's simply a concept, culture, or race that just doesn't exist. Whatever the reason, this character and their origins just don't fit into the game everyone is signed up to play on, and the GM has spent months working on. Your tragic elf, sole survivor of his people, who has been alone for hundreds of years and remembers what the world was like in ages past, simply doesn't work when the GM has built a world dominated by elves who all share a communal empathic link, or in a world that doesn't have any elves at all. A fish out of water character can work. One of my favorites was when my best friend joined an Oriental Adventures game as a Spartan hoplite who traveled from afar. But those have to be done very carefully, and a fish out of water can't be a thing if the world doesn't have any fish to begin with. Number 2, long on word count, short on info. So this one is the kind of thing that makes a GM want to strangle a player. Unlike the out of this world character, there's no sympathy here for the guy who really loved and nurtured this idea only to discover that his samurai warrior isn't great for the 1920s hard-boiled detective game set in New York City. This is the backstory that clocks in around 5,000 words and is filled with useless detail. When I say useless detail, I'm talking about the stuff that just isn't usable in this particular game, or kind of puts a character on the outs of the rest of the group. I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about when you have like full-on conversations between a character and an NPC in their past, detailed down to the exchanges of pleasantries that have no bearing on the present except to try and explain a personality trait or motivation. For instance, let's say a character always carries a baseball with them. The reason is because they used to play baseball with their brother, and as kids it was very special to them. Their backstory includes a detailed conversation between the two brothers where they have a falling out, and later that brother is killed in a drive-by. No mention of the baseball in the conversation, no special significance of a particular ball, nothing but an offhand mention that they liked baseball as kids. No mention of who killed this brother either. Nothing in the conversation is relevant to anything else in the backstory or why he carries the ball with him. Yet the game master is supposed to divine from this doctoral thesis on the character that this is why he always carries a ball with him and that this particular ball is somehow special. Maybe the player wants him to work the pro player who hit the foul ball he carries with him into the story somehow. Maybe he wants to shove that ball into the killer's mouth and bury him alive. We will never know because the player wasted 4 pages on how his brother was he and his brother were swearing at each other over whose turn it was to do the dishes instead of spending page space on why baseball mattered, who this favorite player was, and why this ball was important, capped off with, one night he and his brothers had a fight. Was it over whose turn it was to wash the dishes? Was it over a girl or a car or money? It doesn't matter, it was trivial. But it was also the last time he ever saw his brother alive. That night, the 5th Street Metal Slayers mowed his brother down in a storm of bullets meant for somebody else. Your game master has 3, 4, maybe even 5 or 6 backstories to read. You can't waste your portion of the game master's mental bandwidth on meaningless things like throwaway conversations or details of some long-dead NPC who was somehow important to your character's life. Save it for the in-game anecdotes and stories where your character shares during an appropriate moment. Number 3, too damn long to start with. Spinning off of number 2, it's just simply being too long in general. Like I said, your GM only has so much mental and creative bandwidth to dedicate to backstories, and that bandwidth has to be divided among you and all the other players at the table. So let's say a GM has 40 hours total to put into pre-session 1 prep. That's 40 hours to lay out the campaign, craft the first adventure, read all the backstories, figure out what can or needs to be incorporated early, find hooks for all your characters to come together as a party, and deal with all the out-of-game pre-campaign stuff like rules questions, writing lore, etc. If you hand him a Tolstoy novel, chances are your backstory is at best getting skimmed. Even if it's all fantastic info that fits perfectly into his world and will enhance the game for everyone, it won't matter because reading your backstory will eat up the entirety of his pre-campaign prep time. Don't do it to yourself. In all honesty, your backstory should be more of a SparkNotes wiki page of your character's life kind of thing, not your character's biography. Number 4, too damned old to start with. Right off the bat, yes, age is just a number when starting your TTRPG character. You can easily be a late-in-life adventurer or a long-lived race that just waited until their 100th birthday to set out. Hell, in some games, like the original Traveler, for instance, your age is a game mechanic that helps you stat your character out right there in the beginning. That isn't what I'm talking about here. I'm not even talking about the oddball who shows up to the teenage street punk campaign with a character who's in their 30s. What I'm talking about here is the classic first level character who has already done everything problem. Your backstory should not include epic struggles against the forces of darkness and multiple campaigns in the armies of the Grand Duke where you were made a commander of the Southern armies when you were a second level character who barely knows which end of the sword goes in the bad guy and has a max of +4 on his military tactics check. This happens when the player focuses way too much on the story part and not the back part. The entire point of narrative play in a TTRPG is to let the character's story unfold before you, not to have all the interesting stuff happen before it ever starts. Just think about the Lord of the Rings. How interesting would that story be to read if instead of starting at the part where Frodo has to leave the Shire with his friends on a quest to destroy the One Ring, they start the story after he gets back to the Shire and spends 2 years writing a book and rubbing his sore shoulder before sailing to the Undying Lands. Aside from that, it makes absolutely zero sense. From a simulationist standpoint, how are you supposed to be a simulation of a great war veteran when your combat skills are mediocre at best? From a gameplay standpoint, how have you killed 100 men in one battle and saved the kingdom, yet you're only 2nd level, and you have no wealth to speak of? When you do this with your backstory, you leave the game master 3 real choices. He can break the game to make it fit, he can ignore it and pretend it's not there at all, which would in turn make you feel insulted and pissed and disappointed, or he can turn around and tell you to rewrite it. But that's about it. Number 5, trying to break the game. Closely related to and often a byproduct of the previous entries is writing a backstory that either intentionally or unintentionally tries to break the game. To give you an obvious example, if you include some ancient, powerful family heirloom in your backstory, like for instance your character walked away from the smoking ruins of his murdered family's home, armed with a legendary sword of his forefathers, a blade of ancient and powerful magic that severs the heads of enemies with the wielder when the wielder strikes true, or that after some crooked cops gunned you down, the evil megacorporation took your body and built you into a war machine as a human test subject for their new cybernetic battle chassis. Both of those are kind of cool for a book, or a short story, or a movie, or any other kind of screenplay. But in the TTRPG world, what this translates to is, I'm starting the game with a Vorpal weapon, or I have cyberware that costs 10 times the starting wealth of a PC. This can also be narrative as opposed to mechanical. So those are mechanical examples where your character has something in their backstory that essentially translates to a first level character having an item only appropriate for 12th level characters. But it can be narrative as well. So for instance, if your character is the disposed heir to a throne stolen by an evil uncle, and the GM's game is in a world that's ruled mainly by a singular nation, or it takes place in this singular empire, for instance, that's ruled by a beloved and benevolent ruler who's ruled for centuries by divine providence of the good deities, that doesn't work. Granted, that example stems from either a bad player ignoring the parameters that the game master set forth in his campaign pitch, or from a bad game master who fails to include a very key element of the game world when telling his players about it. But, this is just an obvious example of where the player is messing up the narrative. This is a character backstory that is designed to disrupt the tone and tenor of the campaign, either intentionally because the player's just contrarian, or unintentionally because the player had an idea before agreeing to the game that they're just dead set on shoehorning into your campaign. Number 6, main character syndrome. This one is the bane of tabletop role-playing game players everywhere. Why? Because they all got into TTRPGs because they wanted to take part in the fantastic and epic adventures that they saw in a TV show, read in a book, or watched in the movies. They see Predator, and they all want to be Arnold Schwarzenegger. Not Jesse Ventura, not Carl Weathers. They watch Alien, and they want to be Ripley. The thing is, every character has to be the main character in a TTRPG. You cannot relegate every other player into a supporting role in your own story. All you can do is play a good character and shine in your moments, making them the focal point of your story. Unfortunately, either by design or because many players simply try to make a slightly altered version of an existing character, Many PC backstories end up being the child of prophecy or some other thing that instantly relegates the rest of the party into supporting roles. And unfortunately, that just doesn't work in TTRPGs. You have to have a certain balance, at least in the beginning, between the narrative significance of every character in the party. Now, as they play, the way the dice roll, the way they behave in story, the natural pecking order or leadership roles that are assumed by characters in the story, acting in character, might move one character to be kind of the focal point of the group. But you can't start that way, where this person is the child of prophecy and everything's all about them and all these other characters are just there to make sure he gets there. So, here's a few honorable mentions. Too short, no backstory. You got to give the game master something to work with. You can't give us, 2 sentences and expect us to make your backstory something in the game. What I call beyond the beef. This is a pet peeve of mine and a symptom of the current self-obsessed generation. This is the backstory that starts trying to rewrite the game master's world. Player agency ends with your character. You do not have agency over the rest of the world around you. And beyond the beef is when you start trying to rewrite elements or create whole cloth elements of the game world in order to support your character's backstory. Useless. This is a character whose backstory makes them virtually useless or otherwise harms the party as a whole. Think of a character in a high seas pirates game who gets horrifically seasick to the point of being bedridden when they're not in port. Oh yeah, he's a melee fighter, so it's not like he can cast spells from the cabin when the Kraken appears. Tone deaf. Running a serious campaign in a world where everyone is seeing loved ones die and family pets were eaten to survive? Hey, here's a joke character. Want to run a lighthearted game? Meet my tragic orphan who had to eat his parents' bodies to survive. Whatever it is, this character just doesn't fit. The Cartman ripoff. You ever seen that episode of South Park where all the boys are playing ninjas and Cartman just keeps saying stuff like, "I can see into the future too, but better than Kyle." Yeah, it's that, but with Dritz Do'Urden or Raistlin or whatever other character that the player decided to shamelessly rip off. It's, I'm Raistlin, but more powerful. I'm Dritz Do'Urden, but, I'm an even better fighter. Or, not only can I fight with 2 hands, I can wield a scimitar with my foot. So, how do you avoid these? What are some basic rules of thumb do you just take into account and make your backstory sing? To be honest, it's not really that hard. First is communicate with the game master. This is always a two-way street. The game master has to clearly communicate with their theme to their players as well. But you want a great backstory that gets used in the game, then talk to your GM about your ideas and see how they can fit in. Bring something to them and they say, man, that's great. Just tweak it this way and I can fit it in this way. Next thing you know, you got a full 5 or 6 adventure arc that's all about your character. Tone it down. Okay? Do you think some element is really cool or super important to your character? Chances are you need to reel it in a few notches after writing it. Is your backstory super tragic? You probably need to look at that tragedy and dial it back from a 10 to a 7. And if you think it's already a 7, take it back to a 5. Because 9 times out of 10, what ends up happening is the subtlety you think is in your backstory is so heavily on the nose you may as well be hitting people with a sledgehammer. Focus on your favorite backup character in a group dynamic. I used Predator earlier as an example. Everybody wants to be Dutch, but in a TTRPG, Dutch emerges through gameplay. Instead, think of a character like one of the other squad members. It isn't that you can't model your character after a main protagonist like a Dritz, or a Conan, or a Hamlet, or a Belgarian, or a Druss the Legend. But you have to remember that your character is simply one of several main characters who needs to share in the spotlight and the narrative stakes. To paraphrase Dr. Phil, it's not about you. Give us the baby, not the labor pains. We don't need to know what your character likes for breakfast. We don't need to know that their first apartment was in their roommate's name. What we need to know are just the bullet points of their life. Key elements that are relevant. Tell me that they are consumed with a need for vengeance because of a rising warlord that slaughtered their family and sold them into slavery. Don't write the details of how they killed each villager, the entire dialogue of what they said, and what your character had for breakfast that morning. Then leave out the part where they showed up looking for a magical artifact associated with your culture. This has been a long one for sure. Why? Because backstories are often very important to the player and are a major factor in what makes the game fun and memorable. The GM definitely has a lot of responsibility in this regard, and believe me, you're doing it wrong using character backstories is on the ticket in the future. But the players bear just as much, if not more, responsibility when it comes to the enjoyment and utilization that comes from their backstory. Garbage in, garbage out. I'll leave you with these two things. If your backstory is more than one typed page and font size 12, it's probably too long and needs to be edited. If it's more than 2 pages under those parameters, it's definitely too long. Get with your game master and work together to make that backstory work. And last but not least, remember, player agency only relates to your character specifically. It's entirely up to the game master what happens after that backstory. And your backstory is only your character's perspective. Maybe Daddy was a great war chief, cast out by his ruler due to lies of a manipulative and jealous lieutenant. Or maybe Daddy was full of crap and never made it past sergeant. Or perhaps he really was a traitor. Your character firmly believes his sister died in that fire. Maybe she didn't. That's up to the game master. What did I miss? I know this is by no means exhaustive. Tell me in the comments. Until then, like, share, subscribe, hit the bell, tell a friend, dance the hokey pokey, or whatever the hell else makes YouTube work these days. But until then, I'll see you guys next time.